Hi, my name is Ben Ashworth. This is the Athletic Shoulder podcast, and today it gives me great pleasure to have Jo Gibson on the show. Welcome
Hi,
to
Ben.
the. It's great to see you. Thanks for giving up some of your precious time. I know you're busy all the time, but great to have you on here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. Always good to have a chance to chat about all things shoulders.
Ah, fantastic. Well, I've given a bit of a background to people listening to the show before, but if maybe in your words you can give some background highlights of your rock star career in shoulders. Um,
I wish I could claim to be a rock star, Ben. It'd be nice to have the pay packet if nothing else. Um, I guess because this is the athletic shoulder, I guess generally I kind of always talk about my clinical specialism in the NHS and stuff. But I guess my foray into physio in the first place was very much I was a runner, and failed to get in to do medicine, having not worked hard enough at my A levels. And somebody suggested physio, and it was like the thought of staying home for another year was abhorrent. So I went to uni to do physio. And best thing that ever happened to me. And I was always interested in sports. When I was a junior physio, I was the physio at Nottingham rugby football club. I just look back with horror now, thinking this junior physio let loose with an ultrasound and a bit of whatever. Um, and then through various, I've told the story many times of I basically got into shoulders because I hated treating them. I feared a shoulder patient coming in because I never seemed to do anything very useful. Went on a course about muscle imbalance, thought, need to get about 500 patients back and apologise and actually do some effective rehab. And then by various routes ended up being a shoulder specialist physiotherapist in the NHS. Started to get asked because we were seeing sports people having surgery, commonly stabilisation. Started being asked to go into clubs to advise on rehab because obviously in football you don't see a huge amount of shoulder injuries in relation to everything else. And so then actually worked with one of the physios at one of the football clubs and actually looked at publishing a series of people after it. We called it accelerated rehab, really as a way of signposting a proactive approach to rehab rather than trying to go quicker. And as a result of that, you know what it's like. You then get asked to do more and more things around that in terms of problem solving. So I guess my other sports involvement, I was physio for the British endurance team for about 3 years, mainly because my horse got injured and I couldn't compete. So endurance, you race 100 miles in a day on a horse. And I guess that's where it really cemented my interest in the effect of the rest of the body on the shoulder. So I guess the athletic side of things, those are probably the highlights, but always that underpinning of being a specialist physio since 1995, a very long time.
I mean, it is a very brief highlights, especially around what I know about you, Joe. And I know you're asked to see multiple athletes, and also go into a number of teams as a consultant in a number of different sports, as I sort of outlined before we started this chat. Um, if I ask you then, what are the key things that you tend to be asked to help athletes, individual athletes or teams with? What is it they come to you for?
So certainly when I started, it was very much about advice about rehabilitation generally. And I think if we're honest, if we look at the ACL literature, we like to nick a lot of that and apply it in the shoulder. And it was way behind. So in terms of just being very proactive. So I think in the very early days, this is back in, I guess, the early 2000s, it was very much rehab advice and giving people the confidence that they could get people going a lot earlier. But if I look at my practice in the last 5 to 10 years, it's been a lot more about problem solving. So people who've either had surgery or they've had a long-term injury and they've hit a block or they're not getting back in the time that people think they should, or they've got a problem that won't go away and it's starting to impact their performance. And I think when I when I look at the clubs I've worked with, I hope that we've had a knock-on effect in that the standard of rehab for shoulders has improved a lot and the understanding's improved a lot. So it's kind of good fun and good detective work to then be asked to go in and work out, well, why, if you're doing all those things, why isn't it working? So yeah, I guess primarily it's about problem solving, either after surgery, commonly things like lateral and stabilization, but also some kind of persistent tendinopathy type issues that just aren't resolving despite good rehab.
Yeah, it is interesting to try and add value, I suppose, to performance teams and especially around football from my own experience as well. Going in there, they handle lower limb rehab really well, and then there's almost a blind spot for how they manage shoulders off the back of it, isn't it? So with say a latter J, if we pick out that as an example, or a stabilization, post stabilization, where do people get stuck? What seems to be the kind of limiting factor, for them progressing as quickly and safely as they can through that process?
I think sometimes it's just fear of the unknown and worrying about getting it wrong. And obviously, in a very litigious environment, you don't want to be doing anything that's going to compromise the surgery. I think because if you look at the literature, there's a massive lack of consensus about what constitutes good rehab after stabilisation surgery. You and I might know what we believe is really important, but actually, if you look at the literature, it's very difficult to tease that out at the moment. There's some people about to start looking at those interventions, but it's not widely published. So I think that makes it tough too. And I think because of that reticence, sometimes that almost underpins some of the problems that we see is people get a little bit stiffer than we'd like them to get. So that then makes it a little bit more difficult to target the dynamic system as nicely as you'd like, as early as you'd like. And so actually, to me, those first 6 weeks are absolutely crucial, because I think that if I get called in at 3 months and the person's already significantly stiff, of course, there's lots I can do, but that inherently limits what I'm going to be able to achieve over time. So yeah, I think the underpinning is fear of the unknown, which is weird because Latarjet is such a robust procedure. You have to try pretty hard to wreck it. But also just not having the experience of seeing lots. And because I guess if you've seen loads of ACLs and ankle injuries, you kind of got a sense of how it should go and when things are right or wrong. Whereas if you only see one a year, then non-surprisingly, you don't have the confidence about what that course should look like and the things to watch out for if it's not going well.
Yeah, that rings true. I think the reference point for people, perhaps they lack that reference point for what normal looks like. If they're not dealing with a number, if you're in a rugby club, you probably see a decent number of stabilisations in the off season. But if you're in a football club, although recently I've seen a lot more, these instabilities tend to be, you count them on one hand, and maybe surgery is the same across a season. So when they do arise, unless they've had access to people who have a specialist interest in shoulders, there's less of a reference point for them in terms of where they should be on that pathway, right?
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
So with the sort of systems you mentioned, then like tapping into the sort of dynamic systems, and I know something that you're well renowned for is looking at implementation of kinetic chain assessment and then kind of kinetic chain programming to address some of the things that you find. Now, perhaps you can, I know you've done this a lot on a lot of talks and a lot of resources, but perhaps you can just outline for our listeners kind of where you tend to tap into people around the kinetic chain.
Okay, so I guess what might be useful just really briefly, first of all, is that if I go into problem solving, I'm always going to look at the basics first. So I guess if I had somebody with a Latarjet, the first thing from my perspective is it torn? So has something gone wrong? Have we compromised the surgery? But as I say, generally there would have to be something that happened. But I think, again, when I look at accelerated rehab that's become the big thing, sometimes people do push people a little bit too far, too soon. And so we can compromise the bony fixation, etc. So obviously, is it torn? No. The next thing is it stiff? And if it's stiff enough, is it going to limit the ability of that local dynamic system to do its job? It's really normal to have some stiffness after Latarjet, lose 10 to 20 degrees, and that's fine as long as, based on the limited evidence that we have at the moment, it's not less than around 70% of the other side, because I think once we start to lose more than that, it gets inherently difficult to get that dynamic stability through range. Is it irritable? That's usually just long-headed biceps having a whinge because maybe the cuff's not doing its job properly. And then I like to use symptom modification, aiming at, I believe, influencing cuff function. The shoulder's a real sensory animal. It likes attention. So whether it's closed chain exercises, varying isometrics, doing some through range recruitment, using strategies to just change how that athlete's working. But when it comes to the kinetic chain, there's two key aspects for me, really. Obviously, we're just looking at how the shoulder functions within the body generally. And I guess because of the type of people I'm seeing, commonly they might have had surgery before. So maybe this is the second surgery. They may have friends who've had the surgery and had problems, so there might be some fear around it. So there's a couple of different things that can basically contribute to that kinetic chain involvement. So it could purely be fear of re-injury. It could be a lack of confidence in the shoulder. It could have been bad information, or somebody said something without really realizing the consequence for that athlete about somebody else that had the same and didn't do so well. So then the patient becomes very vigilant. And we know that that translates into their movement strategies. So if you see rugby players, for example, it impact their decision making, and they might go in the wrong side for a tackle because that fear drives a strategy that stops their decision making or processing quite so well. And exactly the same in football. So a goalkeeper who reaches out but actually isn't engaging the kinetic chain, the shoulder's even more vulnerable because it's lost that robust foundation. And I think where physio gets itself in a knot is if you start saying about looking and analysing how somebody's moving, it's like, well, there is no optimal movement. Well, no, but you can look at force transfer, and you can look at how well that athlete is engaging their shoulder with their body doing a functional task. So I'm looking at the kinetic chain in terms of that engagement as they do functional, just moving into ranges where they don't feel confident. But then also their injury history is massively helpful. So yes, the body is resilient, and yes, the body adapts when we've had an injury and it copes. And again, this is where we get in knots about what's normal and what's not, and why some people cope and why some don't. But again, for me, if somebody's had an ACL injury or an ankle sprain or repeated lower quadrant injuries and now has a shoulder problem, that's very relevant in potentially in terms of force transfer through that system. So not only looking at their movement as a whole and how it affects the shoulder, but also looking at potential performance deficits that when that shoulder's in that most extreme position, that could actually compromise force transfer. And because the shoulder is so stable, it's a natural place to try and compensate. So hearing the injury history is massively relevant. If there's a relevant lower limb history or even spinal history, then of course I'm going to look at some performance markers in those, but in context of looking at how they're moving in functional task. And of course, that'll depend where they're at in their rehab journey as to how far I take that and how I can influence with that my rehab. And I guess the final thing about the kinetic chain is, of course, isolated strength and all those isolated parameters are important. However, again, with athletes and people who do something regularly in fatigue, we do have evidence that that can impact what's happening at the shoulder. And my bias, because I see people that are often a long way down the line, having been in patterns of compensation for a long time, is using a very dynamic approach to rehab. So, for example, doing a step up with some through range recruitment or a step up and a hip drive to maximize recruitment through that system is just a really quick, easy fix to set a good foundation and then get the maximum from any local isolated work I might do. Now, I know I can achieve it both ways round, but if I'm really trying to amplify cortical effects and make life as easy as possible to get that local system going, I think we have evidence that suggests that gives us good value.
Yeah, I really like the way that you've tapped into that, especially, it's really common, isn't it, to see history of someone who's got a right shoulder problem, who's had a historical left lower limb injury, and the way that they've, particularly contact athletes or goalkeepers, they can't put themselves in the right space to use their shoulder, for example. So that kind of positioning of the joint, number one, but also then, as you mentioned, force transfer as being critical. And I think probably as well, like, there's quite a tendency to go towards isolated force, right? Whether it's testing something or whether it's loading. That's an easy place to go for an S&C coach, for a performance coach. But what they don't see is perhaps a lot of that work that's done in the initial phases, which minimizes the compensation. So that's really interesting that you end up picking them up at that point, and you still have this really good ability to tap into changing stuff through the use of the kinetic chain. I think that's really useful for our listeners. So thank you for that.
No, not at all. I just think it's really powerful. And I think we get so tied up with the nuance about why what we're doing is working. And I think we have evidence it changes it. And I think if you look at any function, we don't just move our arm on its own, particularly in sport. It's all about that integration. And really, I just look at it that I'm exaggerating that. So I'm making it even easier for the brain. And then whatever I need to target, it's going to be much easier.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, full well around some of the stuff that I do, and I think one of the the misconceptions of some of the shoulder tests that we use, the high threshold shoulder tests, is that they're isolated shoulder tests, but we're always looking at how an athlete moves and how they transfer force, how they position. And the functional task might be pushing into a force plate. It might be pushing into a dynamometer. It could be, snatching a kettlebell overhead. It could be any of the number of things, or throwing or goalkeeping. But it all comes back to the same thing. It's like force. Are they strong enough? Have they got enough mobility? Are they explosive enough? And then can they coordinate all of that together? And I think the missing piece is often, if all those other boxes are ticked, then the coordination piece rises up above everything else, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think and I'm a bit of a fan of the ASH test. And it's funny, I always, when people start kind of saying to me, oh, yeah, but it's only useful for this. It's like, well, no, a test is as useful as its applications and what questions you're trying to answer. And as I've mentioned to you before, I think, again, you might do an isometric thoracic test, as you've demonstrated to me before. You might use the ASH test, but again, what's it telling you? If there's a big drop off between certain positions, and that might be a nice way of quantifying dropout in the kinetic chain. But then what makes sense of it is knowing that injury history, or looking at how they're moving when they're doing something, because then you know how to target it. So I think people get a little bit nervous when it becomes subjective, but it's not really subjective. You can still have the numbers, but you've got to have that application to that function that then really emphasizes that coordination aspect. And I think that's what's fun. It's like finding the cue that makes that resonate for the athlete and feel that difference straight away. And again, that's why an understanding of what kind of engages or excites that sensory system is what we as clinicians give to our patients, whether it's an external cue, whether it's a tactile cue, whether it's just a auditory cue of how they start a movement. And that's part of working with your athlete to know what makes them tick.
Yeah, I think in simple terms, I mean, we're both problem solvers, right? And it's the classic test, put an intervention in, retest. And if we can show change, whether that's a force test, that's a movement test, or that's a patient's perception and feeling and confidence, there's been a change, as long as we can kind of quantify that pre and post. And ultimately, I think maybe what people don't realize is that that's what we're doing all the time. We're sort of applying hypotheses to each individual case and then trying something, and then we're using our best experience and evidence to change something. But the lens through which we see whether they've changed positively in the right direction is a specific marker. That can be subjective, that can be an objective test. Doesn't matter, actually, as long as we're all on the same page in terms of progress or progression, then what we're doing is changing someone positively in the right direction in that particular space.
Absolutely. And I think that's why I really like a kind of symptom modification approach to assessment, and they're using that to inform my treatment. Because if I have an understanding of how the system should work and all the likely things that won't, then I can potentially influence all of those in one way or another, and that gives me immediate win as to how likely that is to be the problem. And if it's not, then it just gives me another, exactly as you say, I'm going to have my hypothesis, and it's how do I rule each one in and out. So a bit of detective work and making sense of the clues. And I think that's really empowering for an athlete going through that process, because that gives them confidence that nothing's been left unlooked at, if you like, but also often will result in them feeling a change. And that in itself, we know, is hugely powerful.
Yeah, when you were speaking earlier about symptom modification, therein lies the building the trust, the building a relationship, the ability to show someone that you can help them. So I suspect when you go in and you change how someone moves, they integrate their kinetic chain, and suddenly they can reach overhead, or they can perform it opens the door, doesn't it, to other parts of your process, and you can start to introduce other bits. But it's that initial engagement which is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just, again, I think as a profession, it's tough, isn't it? Because we're told to embrace uncertainty all the time. And it's the least human thing to do, isn't it? We want to make things certain. And I think for a patient going through, I mean, there'll be times when I know I'm not going to be able to change it because it's stiff, or I've got a really grumpy tendon or whatever. But, most of the time you can affect some change. And as you say, that I think what we forget sometimes, certainly in the non-sporting literature at the moment, it's very much, well, just educate people. Maybe don't even need to do exercise, but it's losing so much nuance, because actually, if you look at one of the most powerful things of communicating reassurance is getting somebody to move with less pain or with less fear. And that's more powerful than sitting down for an hour explaining all the potential causes of their pain. So, why would that be any different in an athletic population? And because if they can't do the thing they love to do, even give them a window where they can do a bit more, as you say, it builds that trust, it allows a conversation, it achieves so many things. So I think communicating through movement and through our assessment is as, if not more important than the other education that we do.
That's interesting around, how do we measure some of the sort of less measurable things, right? So I suppose what I'm getting at here is how do you look at tracking, for example, change in confidence, or change in their perception or fear behavior? How do you look at that?
Well, I mean, there are questionnaires that you can use to do it. So, Tampa Scale of Kinesiophobia is one, fear avoidance belief questionnaire. There's the Orabro that Pete O'Sullivan uses in back pain, when he uses that to track a change in beliefs and in expectations. But again, I think what I've enjoyed, and this is not just like because I'm on your Athletic Shoulder podcast, Ben, but I think what I quite like is, with the ASH. Now, I know in terms of robust measures, the sampling frequency on some handheld dynamometers isn't sufficient for robust measuring of things like rate of force production. But in terms of just having a curve, how quickly and effectively are you actually generating your force? To me, that can be really great, because if you've got somebody who lacks confidence, yeah, I could do a formal and look, and that just tells me what I already know, is they're fearful and they're not actually engaging, they're protecting. But if I show them the difference before and after doing a dynamic through range warm up, or doing a closed kinetic chain exercise through range, and it changes that curve, then I've quantified the effect, and then I expect that to change more over time. But that's when I'm confident I've got the ingredients, but it's just the athlete or the individual isn't moving confidently for whatever reason. It then shows me my education, my reassurance, the exercise I'm using, all those things are combining together to build that confidence, but also importantly give them a really solid foundation of the coordinations to all the things we talked about before.
That is so important, to look at the effect of an intervention. Again, coming back to that, and that's exactly the way I used to look at rate of force development, or even in a sort of butchery of the term, it's like willingness to produce force as fast as you're capable, right? And then sometimes you'd look at someone on a handheld dynamometer and it would take them 3 seconds to get to 70% of a pre-injury max. But then as time went on, or as we changed something, they would start to hit that around 1 second. So that time to peak force measure, which is very variable, is still a useful thing in those early phases of rehab. And also, if you don't have access to all the bells and whistles and the tech, you're not going to be sampling at 1,000 hertz using a force platform. It's just a nice tool to look at an objective measure. So I really like that, and I'd encourage anybody working with shoulders, or any other area of the body, to have a way and a lens through which you can track progress, right? Whatever that is. I think that's really
Yeah,
important.
100. And also, I think even more so with the kind of sports population, quantifying it's massively important for their psychology, because they want an understanding of what's changing, and they want to know that what you're doing is actually affecting that. So, of course, we can measure the basics. And even if you don't have fancy kit, you can still have a functional test that you can immediately retest. I mean, I was doing some problem solving with a goalkeeper the other day, and because I was doing it kind of with the team there and trying to make my thought processes transparent, I think a kettlebell shoulder press or something was causing pain. So we just basically used that as our functional test, and we just went through the potential causes and found the thing that changed it, and then that informed our exercise. And so again, having something that you can remeasure is really important, and that's the kind of basis of what we do, isn't it? Because otherwise, how do you know what you're doing? But in terms of the neuromuscular elements, I really like just grossly rate of force development rate of force, because I think, again, it gives me a lot of information about that neuromuscular system and whether those ingredients are being utilized effectively.
Yeah, it taps into the nervous supply to the muscle and the muscle and tendon to produce force, definitely, especially when you're looking at like windows of around 250 milliseconds or less that we look at. And again, we look at that with the lower body. We look at that all the time, these rate metrics, but we don't have this tendency, because we're so worried about the volatility of those measures. Um, we're not so used to using them. I'd encourage people to explore those more, because with good coaching you can get some decent results.
Yeah, and again, but as no, if nothing else, it's just highlighting that because to me, I think, we've got much better with strength in the shoulder. I think maybe we need to be more specific positionally in certain sports, generally. I'm not saying you, but generally, if you look, I sometimes find people have done great mid-range strength, but maybe there's outer or inner range deficits. But I think generally shoulder strengthening is done better than it was before, because there's so many more resources out there and stuff. But when I look at the people I problem solve, it's often the fear driving the neuromuscular elements, or the neuromuscular elements themselves, because they were immobilized for a period of time after injury, or they had another injury. And so basically that shoulder hasn't functioned effectively, or as effectively as it could, for a long period of time. And we don't know why some people get stuck in those patterns, but they do. And so to just say they'll get better and it'll be fine, we know that's not true. So you've got having ways of being more nuanced, I suppose, or having a quantifiable way of measuring your effect on those things is actually really empowering as a clinician. And to me, it's fun, because you see an immediate change in something you've done. Now, of course, that's just as good if they do a functional task, or they can push harder on a pressure gauge or whatever. That's great. But having just different ways then means you're going to match what resonates with that athlete and really keeps them on track.
We'll take a pause there for a second. Really good, really good. I'll just pause for a second. Give yourself a chance to have a drink. This is off air. We'll edit this out, this bit, obviously. Um, that's great. That's so good. Honestly, like touching on a load of really good areas there, and also, I mean, look, product placement around Ash Test again. I mean, it's just a wonderful thing.
Well, no, it drives me mad, because I went on a course in Belgium, and these two guys had me for breakfast because they work with tennis or something. And they were like, whoa, and they wanted to do that bloody horrible new test, the one with the TheraBand done to metronome, and it gets
Oh,
faster and faster and faster again. And at what point during a tennis match do they do that? And your point is that the Ash isn't. I said, so can I just show you? And I've got these 3 videos of people tennis serving and doing stuff. And I had the Ash test next to it, and went, and then I put their test next to it, and I said, really? And well, they were proper stroppy. But I just like, it's like, guys, no, I'm not saying it's the only test, but I'm just saying it's telling us. And I guess the reason I like it, I always do this thing. You're going to think I'm a bit of a fangirl, but when I'm on the course now, instability always comes up when we do the strengthening part of the course. And I always put up structure, muscle, neuromuscular, kinetic chain, and brain. And then it's right, how are we going to measure all these things? Because everyone goes, what return to play tests do you use? I said, well, what's specific to the questions you're answering? So range of movement, negative apprehension, blah, blah, muscle strength, power. What about all these other things? And of course, what happens is you end up with the Ash test measuring about 4 of the 6 things you want to measure, which is really cool. And I'm not saying you don't do the other bits, but that gives you so much information if you interpret it well.
yeah, it does. I think we are not recording this, although I should soundbite all of that. Um, so, so like the basics of it are right. So I measure, I measure like 90/90 strength with a handheld.
Yeah,
Occasionally, I'll measure like eccentric through range. I don't think I'm expert as Freddie Johansson at doing it, but
no.
or the guys at the LTA at doing it, but I'll occasionally do it because needs must, and then I'll modify Ash test position occasionally, or maybe I'll change input through the left leg as they're pushing through the right shoulder. So fascinating. And my PhD, this is definitely not getting published, but there's a correlation between Ash test RFD in a T position and trunk rotation velocity.
Cool.
Very cool. That's it.
Yeah, very.
End of. I'm moving to America on the back of that bit alone. Yeah, but I was talking to a golf guy the other day, and he's like, "This is so useful because we a lot of our and I'm working with the golf at the moment, as you know, and like a lot of the club head velocity and the throwing velocity stuff correlates to lower half measures.
Yeah,
But the reason for that is because when you measure upper body, it's all here. But if you're measuring it out wide, it's connection of trunk. So then if you think about throwing, golf, tennis, there's this rotational element with a long lever.
yeah,
It's not a shoulder test, it's a trunk rotation RFD test, I've decided. That's
yeah, absolutely. But that's what's great, isn't it? It's like how
yeah,
you interpret it and what it's telling you.
exactly. We can follow up outside of that. I'll publish those bits, but you can have that as a little taste for
Thanks.
all your kind all your kind images of me at conferences going up on screen in front of people. It's great. Thank you.
No worries.
Um, so that I mean, so far it's been a great conversation. I had a few other questions which we can start back on in a second. I was going to say, what do you feel most challenged by with shoulders in mind? But is that something you feel comfortable answering, or have we covered that?
Oh, I guess the challenges are definitely the communication in sport because everybody gets so many things. That's what I find challenging is getting an athlete back on track with rubbish beliefs. And I guess the other thing is just, well, I don't know how I could answer it though, really, is the biggest risk of having a shoulder injury is you've had one already. So,
Yeah,
what do we then tell them to do going forward to minimize?
yeah, okay. I mean, if are you happy to attack it or try and tackle it?
We can try if it goes horribly wrong.
If it goes, yeah, we may end up being a little bit mildly controversial. We may even sell our services to people to come in and problem solve. But let's do that. So I'll start again in a second, and what we'll do is like, what do you feel most challenged by, like with shoulders in mind? Okay.
Shall I say the communication thing as well or not?
I think we covered communication a little bit. Or
Okay,
you could say,
as
we've
we
all,
said before.
yeah, we've
Yeah.
already touched on communication, but like one of the things that I come across a lot is this. Maybe I don't know, something like that. How's that?
Okay.
Let's go. Joe, there's a lot of stuff that you're on top of, and as we've already heard, really nice ways of adding value to teams and to individuals in terms of this rehab and people who've got stuck. But is there something that you feel really challenged by? That's with shoulders in mind, by the way.
Well, I think we mentioned communication before, didn't we? And I think that's always the thing. I think I'm very lucky when I go in as an external consultant because I've got a clean slate. There's no history. I'm not involved in the culture, etc. So often it's much easier for me to have safe conversations. And I think it's really important to highlight that often the communication is where things go wrong. The athlete doesn't have a good understanding, or everybody's trying to give them their version or their model of belief of what's causing it. So, but we kind of mentioned that before. I guess one of the biggest challenges, you and I know that when we look at, we are allowed to call it prevention because the International Olympic Committee decided to call it prevention or risk management or whatever it is. But the biggest risk of having a shoulder injury is you've had one before. So it's like once I and the team have got that athlete back to doing what they're doing, it's what do we then do to minimize the risk of it happening again? And I think that is a real challenge. There's things that I massively value and definitely reflect my bias. And I think there's some really exciting research happening out there in different sports. But when you look at injury in isolated research studies, the injury prevalence is coming down. But I think we've got a lot more to do to try and do that better.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. It'll always be a little bit more challenging around that kind of the understanding of firstly the communication and secondly how we piece together those rehabs. And it's probably a lack of available evidence. It sits a lot within experience, and it's very difficult often to treat individuals, right? We've got a lot of sort of global studies, but actually it comes down to treating the person that's in front of you at the end of the day, which is why research doesn't always capture and translate into the n=1 that sits in front of you.
Yeah, and I love that because I think the thing is, it's almost it's as well as giving that individual the tools to understand that load management, for example, is not just your physical load. It's like you're having a bad time at home or you this, that, and the other. And I think in elite sport, that's done better. But again, it's whatever level of athlete is understanding that so they preempt things because we know that, an increase in daily hassles is another predictor, more of a predictor than many of the physical things that we can measure. So absolutely. And I think that individualization is what's so tough. We haven't found an effective way of stratifying people yet. We do it, we think it works, and then in longer term studies it doesn't. So you're absolutely right. And based on that individual's injury history, not just their shoulder, it's like, okay, what are the things that are going to give me best value to minimize the risk of this system not doing well before? Interestingly, when we did our accelerated rehab paper, when we looked at the people that failed, I think I'm trying to remember now, it's such a long time ago, but bottom line was I think 3 of them had had a lower quadrant injury 6 weeks before. So then it was okay, well, if you've had a shoulder surgery and anything else happens, if you're not already, you need to be upping your shoulder prep work and stuff, or maybe you should just keep it in. And if I look at the goalkeepers that I work with, it's really interesting. I usually give them a couple of just warm up stuff to keep going with, and dynamic stuff that I kind of believe resets the system. And I think we have some evidence to show it does. But they will all go through a phase where they stop doing it. And then they go, oh, Joe, you know what? When I do it, I feel much better. It's like, I was going to swear then. No, Sherlock. But it's really interesting because, again, just really simple ththings sometimes just to try and, I guess, offset what they're doing every day, overloading, fatiguing, and with all, the things we've talked about, session cost and fatigue recovery and things like that, that it's almost anticipating and preempting that and building that into their program. And of course, making sure that the basic parameters of strength, etc., are there. But I find it a challenge, Ben.
Well, that does sound challenging. There's another challenge. We're all challenged, aren't we? But that is a challenge for us. But I like that. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing. One of the things that struck me there as you were talking is, we're talking athletic shoulders, but you've got vast experience outside of working with athlete populations, athlete groups. So is there stuff that you take from working with that population that can assist you when you're dealing with athletes? Is there something that translates from working with, some of the more complex cases you might see in an NHS context to, a goalkeeper on a training pitch?
Well, yeah, but I think, well, many of the things that we've mentioned already, really. I mean, I think in terms of how I approach assessment, it's very similar in both domains in terms of, what's stopping this system being able to do its job. And of course, my starting point is always going to be that psychosocial system. And when we look at lifestyle factors and comorbidities and all the things that are so that's really become the direction of travel in terms of the current narrative in research in the non-sporting population. But again, in an athletic population, all those things, nutrition, stress, etc., are no less important. So to me, there's huge parallels. The communication we've mentioned, again, I spent years trying to come up with solutions for people, non-sporting populations who presented with complex instability. And we found some interesting things in terms of some neurodevelopmental aspects in a small group. We found that we could play with pain processing by using graded motor imagery and mirror visual feedback in another small group, but we were still left with a group that didn't do well. And I think what we've learned now is that there's a group represented with neurodiversity that our rehab just didn't tap in sufficiently to change their motor strategy. But we also found there was a significant group of people where it was basically led or precipitated by emotional or psychosocial aspects. And so I think wherever you work, the pivotal foundation is understanding the why now. So it's kind of easier if you've had an injury or it's a post-surgical patient, whereas in that NHS complex going on, not quite fitting, it's not labeling this is in your head, very far from that. It's understanding that a lack of understanding emotional drivers, psychosocial aspects will impact how you move. So the best rehab in the world, if you keep moving like that, fundamentally, you're probably not going to get as far as you can. But that is just the same in your athlete. So I'd go and see an athlete, and often, in fact, I saw a tennis player and they'd done an amazing job. I mean, the rehab plan was like, geez, there's not a lot here. But actually, what it came down to was what was going on in the person's life and how that was impacting them at times of stress and just tipping over that, I believe, that forced transfer. So it was then giving them things that helped them override that, so it didn't have the same consequence. So, God, that was a real waffly answer, but I think so. For me, all communication is our superpower. I mean, I think it's just the thing that if you don't get that right, it doesn't matter how good your rehab is. And to me, that not moving, what was it? Thoughtless or fearless movement or whatever, but confident, fearless movement, because if you move confidently, you're likely to move well. And to me, a lot of it goes wrong because people don't, but it's understanding why they don't. Is it the physical parameters, or is it a lack of confidence, or something somebody said, or what's going on in their life? And those are the parallels, as well as obviously the kinetic change stuff, which just makes rehab easier.
Let me summarise, Jo. Thank you very much.
Sorry, that was a really blabby answer. I apologise.
No, not at all. I've listened to you speak a number of times, or I'm always making notes, Jo, as you know, when I listen to you when you talk. And I guarantee that there'll be a lot of stuff that people didn't realise was going to come out of this conversation that they'll take home from this conversation. So thanks again for that. So here's a question for you. Like, you're busy at the moment. What's upcoming for you? What's next for you in the coming months?
Whoa, what a great question. So I'm very invested in my online courses at the moment in terms of they all need I'm really keen that they keep representative of the evidence and adding to the learning value. So it's great when you've done it for a few years, you get feedback from everybody that's involved, and you can always make things better. So I'm always looking at ways of evolving that, and that's probably going to consume quite a bit of my time. I've got some interesting talks coming up at the RFU and for TAS, so in sports, which is always great for me because I have a foot in both camps, and it's a really great opportunity to just sit back and reflect on the evidence and whether I need to be doing anything different. But yeah, more of the same, Ben. Problem solving patients, doing my clinical list, doing lectures and updating my online stuff. So yeah, just more of the same, I think. Very bad at saying no, but it's because I love everything that I do, really.
Yeah, on the courses, Jo, where can we'll share some stuff, some links, obviously in our show notes. But where can people find your online courses?
So for English version, it's clinicaledge.co /shoulder success. That will tell you all about that. There is a part 2, but you have to kind of have done the first course first. I also work with a company called Agence EBP, where you can just search them, and that's all translated into French, Italian, and Spanish, I think. So that's a kind of e-learning package that's done especially for them. So those are the kind of 2 main online ones that I do. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram with a very uncool moniker of @ShoulderGeek1, so you can tell I wasn't thinking when I put that one together, but maybe it was appropriate, who knows. And yeah, so I like to put my head above the parapet every so often and just bring a bit of sense sometimes to some of the debates and discussion.
Well, yeah, I'd urge people to follow you around that, and no doubt we'll bump into each other at a conference somewhere, Jo. But like, once again, like, I really appreciate. I know you're very busy, and it's been a great conversation for me, so I'm sure the listeners love it as well. And thanks once again for your time.
Oh, no, thanks so much. Likewise, thanks to you. I think we've had some great conversations every time we meet at a conference, and it always it's just fun, isn't it? Because we're always learning, always developing, always reflecting.
Thanks, Jo. Good. Like